to screen a little ahead of time for our communities that are watching. And so we are here. It's Thursday afternoon, 12 noon. This is Wisdom Sparks. It's a weekly live stream of 316 DC. And for those of you who don't know, 316 is it's a live stream. It's an organization that we provide support for communities, for partnerships, especially partnerships that have faith-based organizations at the heart of them, because we want to be able to share ways that communities of faith can just move outside of our four walls, outside of our comfort zones, to be able to provide solutions in the community. And so this Wisdom Sparks is a new way. It's about a month and a half in we've been doing this. We highlight people of faith and organizations to just show what people are doing, share ideas, share inspiration, because we know sometimes it's just a matter of seeing what somebody else is doing and getting an idea. So I'm so excited. Welcome. Take the opportunity, if you haven't already, go ahead. If you're watching us on Facebook, go ahead and share the live stream, because you never know, it may be you sharing that allows somebody else to be able to see and to be inspired. And so today I'm here with Reverend Dr. Andrew Draper. I'm so excited. I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's the founding pastor. And is it okay if I call you Pastor Draper or
Yeah,
Pastor Andrew?
please.
Okay.
Whatever you would like to call me, Reverend Doctor.
Okay.
Today, that is fine. So thank you.
Awesome. And so he's founding pastor of Urban Light Community Church. It's an amazing church, diverse organization out in Muncie, Indiana. He has a PhD, which I love, in theological ethics, which I'm interested in hearing a little bit about that, because you would think that everything theological is ethical, right?
Right, exactly.
And I think that's important to say, because we're going to see a little bit about the approach that the church he's leading takes in terms of justice and collaboration. You can really see where those additional studies come in. He's also the founding president of the Urban Light Community Development Corporation, which is an organization that's doing a lot of the social services support. And we're going to hear about that today. He's very active in the community. He's a dad, of amazing children. He's also the wife. I'm a fan of Leslie Draper, because she's just girl power, right? She's also the founding executive director of Inspire Academy. And so this family is just really giving of their whole lives in education and community and just support. And so I'm really excited to have you here today, Pastor Draper. To talk about the work that you guys are doing in Indiana and how the rest of us can just be inspired by your story. And so I've shared a little bit about you. Tell us how, with your vast background, like, how did you decide that Urban Light was the right role for you?
Yeah, wonderful. And first, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and it's an honor to be speaking with you today. We did not move to our community with a plan to plant a church, actually. We moved to our community joining several other families who were working toward community development work in a post-industrial town. Our city is not a major metropolitan area, but like many Midwestern towns where the factories have left, there are all sorts of challenges that we face in regard to employment and education and public health and all of those kind of things. And so we joined a community of folks who were working for community development work here on the south side of our city. And we thought we would be here for a few years and then go somewhere else and maybe take some of what we learned here and be located in a larger metropolitan area. But the Lord made it really clear once we got here, and we were simply living in the community and forming relationships, that there were many people in our community that were not connected to the church, were not connected to justice work. Several of the churches around us had become predominantly drive-in churches where the congregants had long since moved out of the community and lost touch with the community. And so we recognized God calling us to work alongside our community, to respond to the needs of our community. And so we've been here now 17 years.
Wow. Amen. And it's awesome because a lot of times we think we're following God, and we are, but God doesn't always reveal the whole picture, and so I love to hear how you're saying, you had a sense just being in touch with God, how the community was changing, how the church was interacting with the community around you, and just being open to respond to that. And I think that's awesome. It's because it's not just about our individual walks and relationships with God, but as you've said in your story, that God shares with us, how our relationship with God can help change how we interact with the people around us.
Yeah.
So I love to hear that. And so, you and I talked before, and I said Urban Light is like a dream for me. I mean, it's what I give my life to. It's why 316 exists, because your church, like so many others around the globe, I mean, it's not a unique thing there. I think there's organizations like yours that exist, and this is why we want to share the story. But you're moving beyond just the four walls. It's not just about coming into a church and attracting people to you, which is important, right? We want to be able to gather in these spaces, but it's also about being infectious in our community, spreading beyond those spaces where we gather. And, you're recognizing that God is interested in our whole being, not just our spirits, but that our spirits and our faith affect our livelihoods, our families, our workplaces, and all these different things. And so, I always, I mean, I tell you, Pastor, I wake up and I go to sleep thinking about this. Like, how can we just set the body of Christ on fire, in understanding that if we just give the totality of our lives, right? Like, if our sacred just spills into our secular, like, it would transform faith. And so tell us a little bit, how did what clicked for you? Like what caused Urban Light to get it? And like, I'm sure it didn't happen overnight. So were there like challenges to getting people on board with that?
Yeah, so a couple things. Thank you. That's a great question. And I really appreciate your passion and wisdom there for the whole person, and the gospel being a holistic thing, and not just about the spiritual, but about the physical and the material as well. I think a lot of, so I come from a predominantly white evangelical background. And I think, there's been a real trend among many people of my generation and younger, who, when we recognize the sort of limited way in which evangelicalism has often shaped people to think about the spirit or the soul as the primary concern in salvation, but sort of to downplay the reality of Christ's kingdom coming on earth, the political and the economic ramifications of the gospel, right? When many of us have come to realize that, we go through this process of deconstruction where we sort of, it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater and kind of walk away from the faith altogether. And I think, I went through a painful process in my own life of recognizing that alongside the wonderful, vibrant faith that was given to me from my culture of origin, there was oftentimes lacking a recognition of the way God is moving in other traditions, and the need to be involved in working for justice in our communities and our society. So, we had some of that ingrained in us from having missed out on it in our own traditions and recognizing the Lord was calling us to it. But then alongside that, one of the really neat things was, I had mentioned we didn't move here with a 5-year plan to start a church. And after living here for about a year and a half, recognizing that there was a need to connect people with the body, then another thing the Lord allowed us to recognize was several faith communities in nearby areas that had been actively involved in community development and justice work for years. And most of those church communities were historic Black congregations. Because oftentimes in many African American church traditions, there hasn't been the separation between, you know, spiritual salvation and political liberation, right? Like,
Yeah.
things can be held together. And so really, one of the gifts that God gave me was, there is a pastor here in Muncie who had been pastoring in a neighborhood close to ours for 35 years. And I saw a lot of the work that he was doing, and he saw the work that we were doing, and he agreed to mentor me. So for about 3 years, we would meet weekly. And as a young pastor at that point, I would ask him questions about, you know, things that I was facing in ministry, and he would give me wisdom and insight from things that he had figured out. And so it really became, and through him, then I was welcomed into many of the Black Ministerial Association works and things like that, where I was able to be a part of working alongside faith communities that integrated faith and justice, you know, that saw that the gospel was whole. And, you know, I think that's a real gift that many predominantly white church traditions need to learn from Black church traditions. You know, many white church traditions separate along the lines of conservative and liberal, you know, so you've got like the fundamentalist kind of religious right, and then you've got sort of the progressive mainline, and oftentimes the two don't have much of a connection to care for the communities in a holistic way. And so, you know, we've really been blessed in Muncie to be able to work alongside other communities of faith and not think that, you know, we have all the answers or we can do it all by ourselves.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, that's the awesome thing about us getting together and working collaborative. You know, we learn from each other as the body, and, you know, we have to just knock down these walls that not only divide us from the community, you know, the church inside of our worshiping spaces from the outer community, but also that divide keeps us separated from each other, you know, because as we're together, we learn from, I can think of a time when it was like, let's pretend like we don't see color, right? Like we don't see cultural differences. And I think that it sort of did us a disjustice. You know, we meant well, and we thought that would unify us, but in fact, the richness of the different cultural ways that we do live out our faith, I think strengthens us as a body. And so let's talk about, you know, usually when we're on Wisdom Sparks, sometimes we'll have people from different communities, different cities, and even different countries. And so one of the things that I've started doing is to be able to show some pictures so people can get a sense of the community in Muncie, get a sense of some of the work that you're doing. So I'll share here. I'm going to share some photos that can just walk us through a little bit about, you know, what are some of these things that we're doing. We know that Urban Light Community Church launched the Community Development Center. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that evolved, and then about some of the programs that you're doing and some of the people that you're reaching.
Yep. So the Urban Light Community Development Corporation is a separate 501c3 nonprofit that was started by the church and by our community that was working toward community development here in our town. The Urban Light CDC today has its own executive director and director of the Lighthouse Recovery Home. So this is a program that was started by an Urban Light Community Church staff member who had been incarcerated on drug charges. And when she had come back out to the community, we had actually helped her find housing And she got involved in ministries here at the church and ended up joining the church staff in an administrative role. But for years, even before her involvement with the church, had a real vision for helping other women transition out of addiction and many of the other things that go along with that. And so she had actually started developing a recovery program while she was in prison. And so we were able to, at that time through our church, help get that started. And then as we were launching the Community Development Corporation, we were able to fold some of those programs over into the CDC as a separate nonprofit because, it helps the integrity of the work to have its own separate board. It helps funding to be open to receiving grants and community partnerships. And so today, the executive director there, Joy Rediger, and Dory Taylor, the director of the Lighthouse, just do wonderful work. I still continue to serve on the board, but I'm just a supporting role for the CDC.
And thank you for explaining that, because a lot of times too, churches get in trouble, right? It's very important to understand that while we want to meet these community needs, that we also need to utilize members in our congregations and partners in the community who can help us think through what are the corporate structures, what are the business parameters and the legal and ethical parameters and financial parameters. So thank you for explaining that. And it's great. The long and short of it too is sometimes people think, well, as a church, we can't get entangled in some of these things, right? We can't get grants, nonprofit assistance, but if it's set up properly, you can do it. And so it's good to be able to see an example where that happens.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, you want me to talk? Okay, so the renovation of the men's recovery home. So what happened last year, I know many of us, going into the COVID pandemic, we're concerned about what it would do to our communities of faith and to our communities, our neighborhoods, our cities. And we faced many challenges. But also, it's interesting that during the pandemic, one of the opportunities that became available to us as a church was a community partnership with another church to start working toward a men's recovery home. For years, Urban Light Community Church has recognized the need for men's recovery. We have many people in our church who come out of addictions. We have a support group in our church called Walk It Out. Several leaders in our church are people who have been set free from addiction. And so that's been a big focus of our ministry over the years. But there's always a need for more resources in a community to focus on recovery housing, particularly because oftentimes transitional housing or a program that is directed toward recovery can be difficult to find, or one size doesn't fit all, or whatever the case might be. So this is something we've been working toward for years, but we had focused most of our energy and resources into the women's program. And then this past year, a church in our community actually approached us and said, hey, we've seen what you were able to do in this women's program, and we've seen the way that the Community Development Corporation has been able to have a 3-phase program that helps people work towards self-sufficiency and freedom. And we are interested in being a funding partner for that. And so, we're always building partnerships. Now we make sure that all the lines are carefully drawn. Mm-hmm. The program is intact, that, the memorandums of understanding are very clearly delineated, so we know who's doing what, and we're very careful along those lines. But it's really exciting that we are going to be next year in 2022 opening a men's recovery home right next to our church, alongside a social service hub right next to our church. One of our associate pastors, Maria Wilson, is a licensed clinical therapist and social worker. And she has done social service work out of our church for years, but has been working toward starting a social service hub in the community that can bring together all kinds of resources, medical screenings and housing resources and other assistance, psychological resources and therapy and other things. And so through these kind of partnerships, we're going to be able to launch the social service hub in one house and the men's recovery home in another house next year. So we did just purchase both of those homes, and we're working now toward renovating them both.
Wow. I mean, it's just so exciting for me because, we think about the pandemic and we're still in it, right? We're making some leeway, we're coming out of it, but it has been just devastating for many communities. We know that there's, people who are losing their houses. We know that mental health crises have escalated, and we know that drug use has increased, and that there's so many of the things that were challenging our communities before are operating at even higher levels because of the emotional, mental, and spiritual impact of this pandemic. And so I think it's great news, whenever we can hear about something good that has come out of this. It's awesome to hear how Urban Light has saw the need around you, right? And even how the other church saw the good work that you were doing with the women's group and approach you about a partnership, that this new opportunity can form and come out of this so that you can service so many more people, right? And you're already doing the work with the women, and I love that it's structured, as you talked about. It's based on evidence-based approach for everyone who's watching. We'll make sure you get the link to the website, because I want you to go on there and hear how the woman who founded it received this vision while she was in prison, but also went and furthered her studies, right? To be able to develop an approach to addiction recovery and reentry that would be successful. And so I love that. And
actually, Pastor Maria Wilson is in this picture down in the lower left-hand side there, on the left in the black shirt and the black face mask there. She and again, just to your point about evidence-based research and the proper protocols and policies and procedures and educational capacity and all of that, she knows her stuff. And so in getting the social service hub and men's home up and running, we are ensuring that we are working with best practices, and that we are ensuring that all of the programming is according to ethical standards and financial accountability.
Yeah. And you're using volunteers. So you have trained people who are, have a passion for this work. They're trained, who are also able to mobilize volunteers who just want to be involved, right? Because sometimes pastors will say, well, our church is small, or our organization is small. We don't have anyone with that training, right? You can get trained, or you can also partner with other organizations who do have the training, so that you can still provide the opportunity for members within your congregation or members within your organization to still be a part of the solution. I want to talk a little bit though, because we're talking about this like it's just the norm, right? You're offering programs around addiction, drug addiction recovery, around reentry. We're talking about people of faith who were previously incarcerated, and not everybody talks about that. It's sometimes seen as like taboo. It's my daughter is a huge fan of like Marvel and all of these superheroes, and sometimes I say, like, when we come into the church, it's as if everybody goes through this whole supernatural metamorphosis, and we become these superheroes who wear capes and are just invincible, right? But the reality of it is, like, churches or any organization of faith is really just a organization made up of everyday people.
Yes.
who have lives, who have had experiences, some good and some not so good. And so we want to get to the place where, as people of faith, that we can be a part of the solution even when the issues are not so easy, right? We don't want to be in a place where we just want to keep our hands clean, right? But we also want to be in a place where we can be a part of the solution and provide services around things like people re-entering the community after incarceration, or even ministering to people while they're still incarcerated, and ministering to people while they're still walking through drug recovery.
Yeah.
But we want to do it in a way without judgment, right? We want to do it in a way where we model the love of Christ, and we help support and disciple people, rather than turning them away. And so,
Right.
what advice can you give for those faith leaders who see these issues in their community? They know that maybe even people in their own congregation are challenged by them, but they don't know how to approach this. They don't know how
Yeah.
to get involved.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. Number one, I would say I really feel for pastors and ministers who want to move their churches toward engaging in the community in a justice-oriented sense, and for whatever reason are constrained by, sometimes church boards, sometimes members with a lot of money, sometimes, denominational structures, whatever the case might be, that, for liability's sake, or for,
Mm.
as you mentioned, kind of public image sake, don't want to or can't pursue some of these directions. That is a very difficult place to be. There's a real sense in which the work that we've been able to do only because it was in our DNA from the beginning. We didn't start with money or staff members. I mean, we started as volunteers. When we started the church, for the first couple of years, I worked bivocationally, doing all kinds of different jobs on the side, to be able to pay for the ministry. And all along, that's the way we've done things. We've raised up people internally. The volunteer who was at work on whatever program in the church, once we had that up and running and it was starting to be self-sufficient, we would then be able to create staff positions and roles for people from within. So we've never been an outside-in organization where we've gone and hired people from the outside. We've always raised up people internally. And so I would say, for churches, when people talk about the limit being, money, or I don't have the money to do this, or I would say money follows ministry. Like, money's usually not the problem. You might not have the money to get something started, but you still have to get something started and have a track record before that money will come. Like, I know a lot of people try to kind of put the cart before the horse and say, well, we can't do X because of money. I would say it's usually that we can't do X because of either, I don't mean this hurtfully, but either a lack of faith that God will provide, or a lack of commitment to start out with next to nothing, or maybe just a lack of openness to people who are different from us. As long as church folk think of people in the community as projects to be invested in rather than siblings, to be learned from and worked alongside, as long as church folk, we think about people as projects, we're never going to be able to do this kind of community development, social justice work, because people don't want to be objects, right? And the way we as Christians are often trained to help people or deal with people is through charity. We want to give handouts. We want to, and I'm not saying charity is always a bad thing. There can be times and places where we need to give things away, and we do that here. But if that's the major way that we relate to the community, long term, we create this us them thing where the people in power stay in power, and there's this power disparity. So like, Dr. Jagade, if I'm coming to you because I need something, and you're coming to me because you want to fix me, our whole relationship then is predicated on you having the answers and me having nothing. And if I then learn to be self-sufficient, then what happens to our relationship, right? And that happens so often in the church. The church folk want to stay on one side of the table, giving the food out, or want to stay in the food pantry, given or the clothing closet, giving the clothes out, or whatever the case might be. And we as the church really have to collaborate with our community. We have to do it with and not for people. And it's only then that we'll see everyone as created in the image of God and as having inherent self-worth. I mean, dignity is not something we can bring to people. People already have dignity because they're created in the image of God. We can choose to affirm it and empower it, or we can choose to ignore it. And I think that's where the Lord has blessed us. Not that we're perfect and that we've always done it right, because it is messy, but it's totally worth it.
Yeah. And I love it. And I can hear the passion behind the words that you're saying. And I can see that you have a clear vision of what God has called you to do, and as you said, it's about not seeing people as projects. When we think about why should we get into some of these issues that make us uncomfortable, it's about loving our neighbor, right? And understanding who our neighbor is. Our neighbor is not just the person that has it all together, or, the suburban mom who is bringing cookies baking them, right? Not like me and stopping at the grocery store and buying them.
Hey,
but our neighbor is the real person. It's the person who struggles with drug addiction, or the person who struggles with homelessness, right? Or is experiencing homelessness, or the person who's trying to figure out how to put food on the table, or it's the CEO that's trying to make right decisions and not compromise, right? Who's not trying to make inferior products for putting profits over people. It's all of these things. It's everyone that we see on a daily basis. And it's those people that we don't see because we avoid the neighborhoods where they are. And so I love that it's not this transactional thing. And that's how it is with God. God loves us unconditionally for who we are, right? Because we're connected. We're birth of God. And God wants us to interact and to think about people in the same way, to just love them because they're human.
You're preaching now.
Yeah. And that just for that mere reason, not because we got a grant, or not because it's going to make us feel good about ourselves, right? Like we can check off charity, or we can get that tax deduction, but because we are human and there's another human who's created by the same God that we're created by. And I love it. You've talked about, how you guys do things. You're very obviously it's a vision for justice and reconciliation, right? And a vision of meeting both short-term needs and long-term needs, right? I know from some of the other things, and let me see what other pictures I have here, but it's a sense of meeting immediate needs for housing and food and other immediate needs that people have, but also keeping an eye on how we are living as humans, right? The systemic injustices around racism or classism or commercialism, whatever those isms are. And it has shaped how you do things. And I think this is so important because as people of faith, we can't do everything, right? We just can't. There's so much need and there's so little resources that we really, and God hasn't called us to do everything. I am of the particular notion, and maybe people disagree, that God, for each person and for each organization, God has put them in that community for a reason, that God knew what the needs were going to be. God sent people to that congregation or that organization for a reason. And so you have a set, the resources you're working with are set, and the need that you're intended to meet is set. So it's not just what we do, but it's how we do it, right? So you have set that as a parameter, or Urban Light has set that. Like, you're going to focus on the things that build self-sufficiency, that address long-term systemic things, right? So we can see that by you focusing on community and housing development and such, right? So I want to just commend you for that, because I think it's really important. And can you say a little bit about if that has shaped, like, are there any opportunities that maybe you've not taken on, or are there any areas that you feel drawn to because that is the vision that you guys have?
Yeah, that's wonderful. So let me say thank you for that question. Let me say first that the slide that you have up about housing revitalization is another program of the Community Development Corporation. And like I said, early when I was the president of the board and the church started the CDC, we were kind of running stuff out of our hip pocket, and it was very limited in what we could do. But now that there's an executive director there, and it's its own board. I mean, Joy has just been amazing at getting all kinds of resources and grants and money to flow back into the community with housing revitalization and redevelopment and all of that. And to your question of maybe things that we have focused on doing and things that maybe weren't in our wheelhouse or we weren't called to do, I completely agree with you. When I mentioned earlier about charity having some problems, that's not, though, to suggest that there are not organizations who are called to meet immediate needs of people who experience chronic and long-term struggles and challenges. I mean, our calling as a church has been reconciliation, justice, and development, not so much charity, because it can be really hard when you're majoring on charity to create the kind of beloved community that is reconciled to one another, and focusing solely on charity can also serve to work against justice at times.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are multiple organizations in our city that are doing really great work with people who may be experiencing chronic homelessness, or sometimes there's people that have experienced so much trauma, or PTSD or mental illness, or things that there are many ways in which long-term resources need to be brought to bear in those folks' lives, that helping them get in a new house is not gonna fix. So I think I agree with you that even though our wheelhouse is in certain areas, we're not called to all things. And so I think that knowing that, like knowing who you are and what God's called you to, and knowing the niche that you're called to fill is really important. And Paul talks that way in 1 Corinthians 12, right? Where he says, if the whole body were a hand, or the whole body were a foot, or the whole body were an eye, or the whole body were an ear, we would be missing certain senses and what certain body parts have to bring to the body. And so I think it's really legitimate for us to know where we fit into the body, to know what is in our wheelhouse, and to say no to things that come along that would detract us, good things even, that come along that would detract us from God's purposes for us.
Yeah. And this is why, like you said, it's the body. We're not the totality, right? But this is why partnerships are so important. As we begin to develop partnerships with other organizations of faith and other sectors, right? Because I love that you guys partner with education, right? Like, or schools. You have the Inspire Academy, and you have medical, right? I saw when you had the Wellness Day that you had medical organizations that are there, and you're offering a vaccine clinic, right? So this is why it's important, because we can be good stewards of the resources that God has given to our particular organization by leveraging them with partnerships, through partnerships with other organizations. So we might meet one need, and then we can refer a family to someone else, but continue to be in communication with them, right? And what that also does, in addition to helping us stay focused on the area that we're supposed to be in. Like I always quote, the Bible says the children of Issachar were able to discern the times and the seasons, and they knew exactly what the church was supposed to do. Amen. So people looked to the children of Issachar for that discernment. They were good in one thing. You had a different tribe who was good as builders, right? You're able to focus on that, but you're also able to build relationships outside of yourselves by working hand in hand to be able to support entire families. What that also does is it helps us be a witness, right? Being a witness is more than just about giving out a tract. It's about partnering with education organizations or government organizations and them getting to witness our faith in action. That's right. By them getting to see that the church can do more than just pray and send good thoughts, but that we do have wisdom, we do have solutions, and we do have committed volunteers and workers, then it helps inspire them to perhaps be transformed by the same God that we're being transformed by. So I want to keep an eye. I don't want to keep you too long, but I know here's the Community Wellness Day that I just talked about, which I think you guys just did recently, right?
Yep. Yes, we did. It's just last Saturday.
Yep. And so again, meeting some of those immediate needs, giving out food, connecting people with the medical organization that's there. And it's the site of the social services hub, which again, as you said, is going to be where all of the resources are. So I want to talk about this slide a little bit because one of the things that I shared with you was that it's disheartening for me. I get to do work. I praise God. I get to meet a lot of people. I get to travel. I go to different cities, different states. And I've even had the opportunity to be in different countries. And I am grateful for the opportunity to build these partnerships that we work on. But one of the things that makes me sad sometimes is the way that people of faith go about them sometimes. Not everybody. Right. Thank goodness it's not everybody, but for some, we sometimes approach these ministries, as I see them, our opportunities to serve with a sense of superiority, right? I don't say words like rich and poor. I say they're either more resourced and less resourced, because on any given day, if the resources turn away from us, we could all switch situations, right? Yep. But sometimes when we do decide that as people of faith, we're going to provide services and support for families who have greater or different needs, we sometimes see it as like, God is showing up to this neighborhood because we're coming, right? And like, we're the sacrificial lamb that is laying down our lives for God to go to these wretched people in these wretched neighborhoods that we wouldn't be seen on the corner of, on any other circumstance. And it makes me sad because we do approach people like projects. Yeah. And sometimes we do talk about people who are less resourced as if they're, just by knowing that they're less resourced, we automatically know that they're unsaved or disconnected to Christ. And I can tell you that I have been at stages of my life where I didn't know where my next meal was coming from, but I was very, very much on fire for God, right? Yeah. And so how do we, especially now, right, through the pandemic, racism is historic from the foundation of America in the entire way that America was formed in our government systems, education, justice, everything. But we've been talking about it much more with the pandemic and what happened with George Floyd and some of the other situations. it's tough when you're in affluent, mostly white congregations who talk about connecting with communities, Black and Brown congregations, as if they're doing them a favor,
That's
right?
right.
And so how do we, and I'm grateful that you and I have this, as people of faith, that we can talk about this together,
Sure,
right?
sure, absolutely.
And so how do we change that? How do we
Yeah,
inspire people of faith of all races, of all economic backgrounds, to take on, like Philippians says, to be like Christ, who thought it not robbery to humble himself, right?
yeah,
To come to us. How do we come to others in that
yeah,
same way? And I love when I saw this, I don't know the right word, the commendation or the
yeah,
donation of this statue, because I think it speaks to that humility in such a good way.
yeah,
So what would you say
yeah.
to us about that?
Yeah, that's really good. There's so much to unpack there. I mean, as a white man raised in the church, I was encouraged to think about mission alongside reconciliation in an unhealthy way. And what I mean by that is, in white evangelical circles, you often hear people talk about like the need for us to share the gospel with people all around the world. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be part of sharing the gospel as Christians, but the mental exercises we enter into then are things like, who's going to share the gospel with, the impoverished kid in an urban neighborhood, or who's going to share the gospel with, the tribe in Africa, or who's going to. So a racial calculus exists oftentimes alongside the way we think about mission, so that we're especially as a white man praised for going into an ethnically diverse and under-resourced urban community. Early on when we moved here, we were, people talked about us just as if we were like laying down our lives and being Jesus to the community and all of that. The problem with that is it doesn't recognize, like you said, the ways that Jesus is already at work in the community, the ways that just because somebody does not have access to certain resources within society is not a reflection on their proximity to God. In fact, oftentimes it's exactly the opposite, right? I mean, Jesus very clearly says that there is a danger in gaining the whole world and losing our soul. That, honestly, I think sometimes some of the most dangerous places to be are places where affluence, it runs amok, because the same problems exist there, the same problems with drug use, the same problems with unhealthy ways of living lives within family structures oftentimes. I mean, very similar problems exist. They're just kind of, swept under the table, or they're policed differently, or they're treated as public health crises rather than a war or something, and I'm not saying that we should be, locking up people who are struggling with drug addictions. But what I am saying is that's the way it often happens in the cities and in communities of color, when it doesn't necessarily happen the same way in more affluent communities or predominantly white communities. And so, this statue sort of symbolizes that Jesus is identifying with the least of these. It's not a matter of us being Jesus to our community in a unilateral sense.
Yeah.
It's a matter of us finding Jesus at work in the world.
Amen.
And so coming into the community that we came into at the beginning, yeah, there were times that I thought of myself in a bit more of a heroic posture than I do today. There were times that I thought more about the privileges that I was laying down in order to whatever. But very quickly, it didn't take long living here to recognize that God was already at work here, and I needed to recognize where God was at work and stop thinking that it began and ended with me. I mean, I remember early on praying one day, just like, early on in the life of our church, we weren't a very racially diverse body. And I remember praying one time, like, oh God, we've got this passion for reconciliation. Why isn't there more diversity in our church? And like, I was convicted by the Spirit that, Andrew, you're praying for your church to be a racially diverse body. And I'm not focused on your church. I'm focused on the whole community. I'm focused on reconciliation within your community, not just at the stuff you're leading.
Amen.
And so I had to realize, wait a minute, I got to recognize what other people are doing and come alongside and learn from and be a part of, especially African-American leaders in the community. If white folks are ever going to be able to do cross-cultural mission or urban community development well, we have to recognize that we need to learn from and be mentored by and submit ourselves to leaders from other cultural traditions, from other theological trajectories, because otherwise it's always going to be paternalism. It's always going to be viewing ourselves as Jesus. And then it creates the kind of ridiculous stuff that we see when, predominantly white suburban churches come into a community of color and do the same vacation Bible school or whatever year after year after year after year, and go back to their funders and say 25 people accepted Jesus. And it's like, it was the same 25 kids who accepted Jesus. Or most of them didn't actually need to accept Jesus because their grandparents were already in the church and taught them. It was more just something for them to do for a week, which isn't a bad thing, but don't then claim it as something it's not, right? Like, we need to respond to the needs in the community, not assume that we know what the needs in the community are.
Right. And I think all of us need to be honest about what our role has been historically in creating those needs within the different communities, right? Like, it's funny, right? It's always interesting when we rescue people from problems we created, right? So I think for all of us, you've said it well, it's a matter of each and every one of us being in a relationship with God, in those times of prayer, being honest and vulnerable and open to God and saying, Lord, show me, right? Show me myself. And show me those areas and those places of bias within my own self so that I can truly live out the love of Christ in others, and to express that love to others. Not with conditions, right? Not I'm going to love you if you come to my church, or I'm going to love you if you think the same way that I do, or vote the same way that I do, or look the same way that I do, but I'm going to love you because Christ loves me.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm going to love you in the same way that Christ loves me, which is unconditionally. And I think in doing that, then people will truly have space to be able to live their best lives. Like my kids say, allow me to be great, right? Each person will have the opportunity to be great because they'll have the resources they need to take advantage of opportunities that are right for them. But also they will become interested in meeting the God that has transformed us from the place where we weren't in that place to love, right? And so thank you so much for coming today and sharing. Wisdom Sparks, again, it's a program and an effort of my organization, 316 DC. We are available. We exist to help people of faith use the totality of their lives in transforming the world around them. And so as we close, any last words of advice or thoughts to people who might be watching, just to get them inspired to make a difference like you are?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jagade. I was struck by just a moment ago when you mentioned the phrase saving people from problems that we created. And again, I am not bashing the church. I'm not running down Christians. There's so much good stuff that I was given by my culture of origin. But as a white Christian, I can say without hesitation that there are, especially white evangelicalism right now, we are in trouble, tied in with so much historical white supremacy and doubling down on it. And what I wanted to say along the lines of your comment is this church building here that we're in right now is a gorgeous, beautiful 100-year-old brick building. It was founded as a United Methodist congregation, or at that time Methodist Episcopal. Really wonderful place, wonderful work done over the years. However, it's on the east side of Madison Street, which was the historic dividing line of segregation, which means it was built in a predominantly Black neighborhood. But African Americans in the community always knew that this was not a place for them. Maria Wilson, one of the associate pastors here, said very clearly when she was a young African American girl in the community, she knew that that was not a church that you could go to church at as a Black woman, Black girl at that point. Now you could go to Head Start in the basement if you were a kid to get help from the white folks, but it was not a place that your family went to worship. And so now that we are a multi-ethnic church, and now that Urban Light owns this particular building, it's been really interesting that the majority of funerals and weddings and special services that we have here are predominantly Black. And I think one of the main reasons for that is there has not been very many large church spaces in our community that historically were open to African Americans. And it's almost like God has allowed us to be a part of helping redistribute this building and the resources that are there to the community in which it's located. And so you could phrase that as, well, look at the great work you're doing, Pastor, helping people out. But really, what you mentioned earlier holds exactly true. Saving people from the problems you created. Like, I have to recognize my historical complicity with systems and structures that could create spaces that excluded others.
Yeah.
And then I can turn around and just be a part of God flipping the tables and allowing the goodness of God's creation to be available to all people. So again, it's just beautiful the way you framed it.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks again for being with us. Thanks for the work that Urban Light is doing. And thanks for just all of us. And I just encourage each and every one of us to just daily spend that time with God, reflecting on who we are and allowing God to help us see ourselves so we can all be great. So thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again next week, next Thursday at noon, where we'll come again with Sparks of Wisdom to encourage you